Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Xenos, and I am a speaker and coach. I mentor women in the areas of health and wealth. And in this series, we're talking about biohacking, which is one of my favorite topics. Biohacking is the idea that we can make changes in our environment and to our habits in order to make huge impacts in our health and wellness. And this week, I'm going to be talking about light again. In the first episode, I talked about sunlight and the morning light being so good for us. And this week, we're going to be talking about blue light. You've probably heard that there can be some negative impacts of blue light. And the truth is that most of the negative impacts of blue light happen only in the evening. So while blue light, staring at your phone all day, probably isn't the best, the normal amount of blue light in our environment during the day probably doesn't do us very much harm. However, blue light exposure at night or overexposure is correlated with increased risk of serious illnesses like heart disease, cancer, obesity, and diabetes. And also, blue light impacts our circadian rhythm, right? So at night, if we're getting blue light from our phones or screens or TVs, it's telling our body, you're not tired, it's daytime, right? And too much blue light can also impact our stress levels, which is another thing that can be very important for us busy women. So the challenge this week is to do a blue light fast 2 hours before bedtime. So if you normally go to sleep at 11, after 9 p.m. each night this week, phones and screens should be turned off and find other activities such as journaling or reading or hanging out with your loved ones. So that's the challenge for the week. And then just notice if there's any impacts, especially on your stress and your sleep.